name is Quinn Vasquez, and 3 weeks ago, my mother-in-law stood up at her own anniversary party in front of 60 guests and told them I was the reason her son settled for less. She said it while holding a champagne flute, smiling, like it was a toast. Then my husband's grandmother set down her fork, pushed back her chair, and said one sentence that made the whole room go silent. "Margaret, do you want to tell them what you signed in 1994, or should I?" But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand why an 81-year-old woman would say that, you have to understand who I am, who they thought I was, and the thing I'd been keeping in a fireproof box in my closet for almost 2 years. I'm 31. I run an HVAC and electrical contracting company in the suburbs north of Columbus, Ohio. I install the systems that keep hospitals running when the power grid hiccups. I crawl through attics in August. I have a permanent callus on my right palm from a wire stripper and a scar on my forearm from a sheet metal edge that taught me to respect ductwork. I love my job. I am very, very good at it. And for almost 5 years, my husband's family believed I was a glorified handywoman who got lucky marrying their golden boy. Let me back up. I met Daniel when I was 25 at a Home Depot, of all places. He was standing in the conduit aisle holding two different junction boxes, looking like a man who had been defeated by his own kitchen. I told him which one he needed. He asked if I'd come look at the actual problem because he was pretty sure he'd done something dangerous. He had. He'd backstabbed a receptacle on a 15-amp circuit and was about to push his luck with a window AC unit that drew more than the wire could handle. I fixed it in 20 minutes. He took me to dinner to say thank you. We've been together ever since. Daniel grew up in Bexley, which, if you're not from Central Ohio, is the kind of suburb where people say we don't talk about money specifically, so you know they have it. Old brick houses with slate roofs, garden clubs. His father, Richard, was a partner at a corporate law firm downtown. His mother, Margaret, came from what she liked to call an established Cincinnati family, which, as far as I could tell, meant her great-grandfather had owned a department store that went bankrupt in 1981. But the idea of money lingered in that family long after the money itself had thinned out. They kept up the house, the club membership, the right cars in the driveway. Appearances were the family business. And then there was me, Quinn, from Whitehall. My dad drove a delivery route for a bakery distributor for 31 years. My mom did medical billing from a desk in our spare bedroom. We weren't poor, but we were the kind of people Margaret's people hired and then forgot the names of. The first time Daniel brought me to Sunday dinner, Margaret asked what I did. I told her I was an electrician working toward my contractor's license. She tilted her head like she hadn't heard right and said, "Oh, like for a company?" And when I said I hope to start my own someday, she gave Daniel a look I'll never forget. A look that said, "This one? Really?" I should have seen it all coming from that look. For the record, my grandmother-in-law, Daniel's grandmother on his father's side, was different. Her name was Adela, and she was 80 when I met her. Sharp as a tack, dry as a desert. She'd worked her whole life. She'd been a surgical nurse for 40 years and had no patience for what she called the costume party the rest of the family put on. The first time I met Adela, she looked at my hands, took one of them in hers, turned it over, ran her thumb over the callus, and said, "Good. Working hands. Don't ever let them shame you for it." I almost cried right there at the table. I didn't know yet how much I'd need those words. Here's the thing nobody told me. The thing I pieced together over years of overheard arguments and Adela's offhand comments. Richard, my father-in-law, the corporate lawyer with the corner office, had not actually come from money. Margaret had married him believing he would inherit it, and when it turned out there was very little left, she spent 30 years building a story instead. The brick house was mortgaged twice. The club dues were paid late, then later. Richard worked brutal hours not because he loved the law but because the family's entire identity was propped up on his salary, and one missed quarter would have brought the whole stage set crashing down. But I didn't know any of that in the early years. All I knew was that I wasn't good enough, and they made sure I felt it at every gathering. Daniel and I got married in 2021. Small ceremony, his choice as much as mine, which his mother never forgave. At the rehearsal dinner, Margaret introduced me to a family friend as Daniel's wife. She's very handy. The friend laughed like it was a joke. I smiled and said nothing. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. He always squeezed my hand. He never quite said anything though, and back then I told myself that was enough. Let me tell you about the dinners because the anniversary party wasn't the first time. It was just the loudest. Thanksgiving 2022. Margaret seated me next to the 11-year-old. Not because there wasn't room at the adults' table, there was an empty chair right next to Daniel, but because she said, I thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere casual, dear, since you come straight from your jobs. I'd worn a blouse and slacks. My hands were scrubbed raw. I sat next to a kid who spent the whole meal showing me videos on his phone, and when he asked why a grown-up was at the kid's end, I didn't have an answer. I left before pie. I cried in the car in their driveway for a full 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Easter, 2023. Daniel's younger sister, Blel, brought her new boyfriend, a guy who did something in private equity that nobody could quite explain. Margaret introduced everyone with their credentials. This is Brielle, she's at the Museum Foundation. This is Trevor, he's in finance. When she got to me, she paused and said, and this is Quinn. She does, contracting work, trade stuff. Trevor nodded politely and never spoke to me again. Later in the kitchen, I heard Brielle telling him, Quinn's sweet, she just doesn't really fit. Daniel's always brought home strays. I was standing at the sink. I'd heard every word. I put down the glass I was rinsing, dried my hands, and went to find Adela, who was sitting alone on the porch. She patted the seat next to her. We didn't talk. We just watched the yard. After a while, she said, They're afraid of you, you know. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. The 4th of July, 2023. Big family barbecue at the house in Bexley. 40 people. Richard organized a group photo of what he called the family's bright lights, which turned out to be Daniel, Brielle, 2 cousins, and Trevor. He arranged them on the porch steps. He did not call my name. I stood by the cooler with a paper plate, watching my own husband get arranged into a photo I wasn't in. Daniel caught my eye. He looked away. He looked away. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did, for a long time afterward. The photo went up on the family group chat that night. So proud of our future leaders. 23 thumbs up. I wasn't in it, and I wasn't tagged, and my husband said nothing. That night Adela called me. 9 o'clock. She said, I saw the photo. You know why I wasn't in it either. Because I told Richard I'd rather be caught dead than pose for that nonsense. I laughed so hard I started crying, which is a thing only a dealer could make happen. September 2023. Margaret hosted a ladies' luncheon for some charity board she was trying to get onto. She invited Brielle. She invited the cousins. She did not invite me, and when I found out, she said, Oh, I didn't think it would be your scene, sweetheart. All that small talk. You're so practical. Practical. The way she said it, it was a slur. Here's what none of them knew during any of those dinners. By the end of 2023, I wasn't an electrician working toward a license anymore. I'd gotten my master electrician license in 2020. Took the exam after 2,000 hours of documented work and 4 years of trade school at night while running service calls during the day. I passed on the first attempt. The next year, I added my HVAC certification. And in March of 2022, 3 months after Daniel and I got married, I quietly filed the paperwork to incorporate my own company. I called it Meridian Mechanical, LLC. 2 trucks. Me and one other tech named Hollis, who taught me half of what I knew and agreed to come work for me if I promised never to make him do residential service calls again. I told my own family. I did not tell Daniel's. I told Daniel, sort of. I said, I'm starting my own thing. And he said, that's great, babe. And never asked a single follow-up question, and I let it stay vague because part of me was testing him, and part of me was protecting something I didn't have words for yet. Meridian grew fast. Faster than I'd planned for. Commercial work mostly, which is where the real money is, and where nobody cares whether you came from Bexley or Whitehall. They only care whether the system passes inspection and whether you show up when you say you will. I showed up. I always showed up. By the end of the first year, I had 6 employees. By the end of 2023, I had 19, 3 service trucks and a box truck, and a shop off Route 161 with my name on the lease. And then, in the fall of 2024, the contract came in that changed everything. There's a regional health system here. 4 hospitals and a couple dozen outpatient centers, and they put out a bid for a full mechanical and electrical retrofit of their main campus. New chillers, new switchgear, redundant power systems, the works. The kind of job where if you get one calculation wrong, an operating room loses climate control during a surgery. It was the biggest project in central Ohio that year. The estimated value was $11.4 million. 14 contractors bid. 2 were national firms out of Chicago. The rest were regional. Meridian was the smallest company on the list, and I was the only woman who owned one of them, and I was 31 years old. I spent 6 weeks on that proposal. 110 pages. Engineering calcs, redundancy plans, a phasing schedule that wouldn't shut down a single patient floor, safety records, bonding, references from every commercial job I'd ever finished. I didn't sleep much that month. In October of 2024, I sat across a conference table from the health system's chief facilities officer, a no-nonsense woman named Delphine Okafor, and 2 engineers. My business attorney, a guy named Sebastian Reyes, who'd helped me set up the LLC, sat beside me, and Delphine looked at my proposal, looked at me, and said, "You know, I almost didn't take this meeting. You're younger than my associates. But your phasing plan is the only one that doesn't put a patient at risk, and your inspection record is cleaner than firms 3 times your size. Who taught you to think like this?" And I said, "My grandmother-in-law. She was a surgical nurse for 40 years. She taught me that when you're working on something a life depends on, you do it right or you don't do it at all." Delphine smiled. We signed the contract that afternoon. $11.4 million, an 18-month build. My company name on every permit, my master license number on every electrical filing, my signature on the whole thing. When we walked out, Sebastian grabbed my arm and said, "Quinn, you understand your name is about to be in every trade publication and every county permit database in the region. You can't keep this quiet anymore." And I said, "I'm not keeping it quiet. I'm just not announcing it." He looked at me for a long second and said, "There's a difference between modest and hiding. You're hiding. From who?" I didn't answer. I think we both knew. The press release went out in November. Small write-ups in the Business Journal and the local trade newsletter. Meridian Mechanical, owner Quinn Vasquez, awarded $11.4 million healthcare retrofit. Now here's the part the commenters always ask about, so let me get ahead of it. How did Richard, a man who read every business journal in the state, not see my name? 2 reasons. First, my company isn't called Vasquez anything, it's called Meridian, and he had no reason to connect it to me. Second, and this is the real answer, he saw the words mechanical contractor, and his eyes slid right past them the way they always did. To that family, my world was invisible. You don't notice what you've trained yourself to look down on. So they didn't know. Through Thanksgiving 20 to fall, through Christmas, through a spring full of the same little cuts, they didn't know. Which brings me to the box in my closet. In December of 2024, I went to visit Adela. She was 81 now and had moved into a smaller place, an assisted living apartment, after a fall. We were going through her things because she insisted on sorting everything herself while she still could. She did not want anyone rifling through her life after she was gone. Adela was like that. We were emptying a closet when I found a banker's box, taped shut, labeled in her handwriting, House, Bexley, 1994. She went very quiet when she saw it. Then she said, "Open it. You should be the one who knows." Inside were documents, old ones, a mortgage, a second mortgage, and a loan agreement dated 1994 between Adela and her son Richard. $40,000, which back then was real money, to keep the Bexley house out of foreclosure. There was a promissory note. Richard had signed it, so had Margaret, as co-borrower. The note had a repayment schedule, and clipped to it was a ledger in Adela's careful nurse's handwriting, tracking 30 years of payments. The last entry was from 2003. After that, nothing. They'd stopped paying her back in 2003 and never started again. The house that Margaret used to look down on me from, the house where I'd been seated at the kids' table, had been saved from the bank by the 81-year-old woman they treated as an embarrassment to be seated at the far end of the table. Adela watched my face while I read it. She said, "I never asked them for the rest. I didn't need it. But I kept the paper. You keep paper, Quinn. Always keep the paper." Then she said something quieter. "They built a castle on a loan from a nurse and then spent 30 years pretending nurses weren't good enough to sit with them. I let it go because Richard's my son. But I'm tired, sweetheart. I'm so tired of watching them do to you what they did to me. I took the box home. I put it in the fireproof safe in my closet, the one where I keep my license and my passport and the deed to my shop. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I told myself I'd never use it. I just couldn't let it sit in that apartment where, after Adela was gone, it would have ended up in a dumpster, the truth thrown out with the rest. I want to be honest about something here, because the version of me in this story isn't a saint. I sat on all of it. The contract, the company, the box. Part of me kept waiting for proof so undeniable they couldn't wave it away. Waiting, I think, for permission to stop pretending I was small. Daniel still didn't fully know what I'd built. We'd grown careful and quiet with each other, two people in the same house circling something neither of us would name. I loved him. I just wasn't sure he saw me, and I was terrified to find out. Then came the anniversary party. Richard and Margaret's 35th wedding anniversary, the second Saturday in May. A tent in the backyard in Bexley. 60 guests. Caterers, a string trio, the whole costume party in full dress. Daniel and I were expected, of course. Adela was there too, in a wheelchair now, parked at the head of a table with a glass of wine she wasn't supposed to have. I'd had a hard week on the hospital job, a switchgear delivery delay, and I came to the party tired, but fine, in a navy dress, with my hair down and my hands, as always, scrubbed and bare. I'd taken my work boots off. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I did everything right. I showed up clean and gracious to celebrate two people who had never once been kind to me. Dinner went the way those dinners always went. I was seated, naturally, at the table farthest from the head. Trevor, now Brielle's fiancé, held court about his fund. Margaret floated between tables in a way that always managed to skip mine. Then came the toasts. Richard went first, the usual. Then Brielle. Then Margaret stood, glass in hand, and started talking about family and legacy and how proud she was of the people her children had become. She talked about Brielle's brilliant match, and then she turned and she looked at our table, at Daniel, and she said with a smile in front of 60 people, "And Daniel, my sweet Daniel, we always hoped he'd find someone who'd push him to be his best, someone with ambition." A pause. "Instead, he found someone content with very little. But that's love, isn't it? Sometimes our children settle and we just have to learn to live with the choices they make." She raised her glass. "To settling for less if it makes you happy." A few people laughed, uncertain. A few looked at their plates. I felt my face go hot. Daniel's hand found mine under the table and gripped it hard, and I waited. I waited for him to stand up to say something, and he didn't. He just gripped my hand, and I thought, here we are again, and something in me that had been holding for 5 years finally, quietly, let go. And then Adela set down her fork. The sound of it on the china was small, but everyone heard it because the tent had gone the particular kind of quiet that follows a cruelty. She put both hands on the arms of her wheelchair and pushed herself up, slowly, 81 years old, refusing the hand the caterer offered. She stood, and she said, in that dry, clear voice that had told frightened patients the truth for 40 years, "Margaret, do you want to tell him what you signed in 1994, or should I?" Margaret's smile froze. "Adela, sit down. You're tired." "I'm not tired. I've been quiet too long, which is different." Adela looked around the tent at 60 faces. "My name is Adela. I'm Richard's mother. Most of you know me as the old woman they wheel in for the holidays. What you don't know is that in 1994, this house, this beautiful house you're all drinking wine in, was 11 days from foreclosure, and I wrote a check for $40,000 to save it. I have the note they signed. They paid me back for 9 years, and then they stopped. I never asked for the rest. I just kept the paper." The string trio had stopped playing. Nobody had told them to. "And tonight," Adela went on, and her voice cracked just once. I watched my granddaughter-in-law, a master electrician who built a company with her own two hands, get toasted as someone who settles for less, by a woman whose entire life was paid for at least once, by a nurse she wouldn't seat at the good table. She looked at me. Quinn, I'm sorry. I should have done this years ago. I let them shame you the way they shamed me. And I called it keeping the peace. It wasn't peace. It was cowardice. And I'm too old for it now. I couldn't move. 60 people were staring. Margaret's face had gone the color of paper, and then Delphine Okafor, the chief facilities officer from the hospital system, who, I would learn in about 90 seconds, was an old friend of Richard's law partner and had been invited as a courtesy, stood up at a table near the front and said, "Wait, Quinn Vasquez, Meridian Mechanical? You're doing our entire hospital retrofit. That's an $11 million job. I personally selected your bid. You're telling me she's family." The whole tent turned to look at me. I'd spent 5 years being invisible to these people. I want to tell you I had a speech ready. I didn't. I just stood up, because Adela was standing and I wasn't going to let her stand alone, and I said the only thing that was true. I'm Quinn. I'm a master electrician and a mechanical contractor. I own a company with 19 employees, and right now we're rebuilding the systems that keep a hospital running so that when somebody's mother is in surgery, the room stays the temperature it needs to be. My grandmother-in-law taught me that. Not a single person at this table taught me anything except how it feels to be looked down on. And I'm done feeling it. I looked at Margaret. You toasted to me settling for less. The only thing I ever settled for was sitting quietly while you treated the woman who saved your house like an inconvenience. I'm not settling for that anymore. Neither is she. I went to Adela. I took her arm, and I walked her out of that tent past 60 silent people, past the string trio, into the cool May evening, and I helped her into my truck, and we sat there in the dark, and she started to laugh, this wheezing, delighted laugh, and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, did you see Margaret's face?" And I started laughing too, and then I started crying, both at once. Daniel came out a few minutes later. He stood by the truck. He didn't get in. He said, "Quinn, why didn't you tell me? About the company, about all of it." And I told him the truth, because for 5 years you held my hand under the table and never once stood up. I needed you to see me before I showed you, and you didn't ask. Not once did you ask what I was building. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "You're right. I was a coward too. I told myself I was keeping the peace." He looked at his mother's house. "I don't want to keep that peace anymore. It wasn't a movie. He didn't fix it in one speech. But he got in the truck, in the back, next to his grandmother, and the three of us drove away, and that was a start. The fallout was about what you'd expect. Margaret didn't speak to me for 2 months. Richard called Adela the next morning, furious, and Adela told him in her dry way that she had the original note in a safe deposit box, and that if he ever raised his voice to her again, she'd let the rest of the family read the ledger. He hasn't raised his voice since. Plial, of all people, texted me a week later. I didn't know about any of that. I'm sorry. The kids' table thing was wrong. All of it was wrong. We're not close, but it was something. The hospital job is 40% done now, on schedule, under budget, on 2 of the 3 phases. Delphine and I have lunch sometimes. She introduces me to people as the contractor who saved my retrofit. And every single time I think about a tent full of people who thought I'd settled for less. Daniel and I are in counseling. Real counseling, the hard kind, where you say the things you spent years not saying. Some days I'm not sure we make it. But he comes to my shop now. He learned the names of my crew. Last week he watched me pull a permit and read my license number off the wall, and he said quietly, "I can't believe I lived with this for years and never looked. It's not fixed." But he's looking now. And Adela. Adela moved in with us in June. We converted the downstairs office into a bedroom for her. She sits in the kitchen in the mornings with her coffee and tells me which of my employees she'd have fired and which she'd have promoted, based on nothing but how they hold a coffee cup, and she's usually right. She flamed a 1994 promissory note and hung it in the downstairs hall. When people ask about it, she just smiles and says, "That's the receipt for a castle." I kept the box. I'll always keep the box. Because Adela was right about paper, but she was right about more than that. She was right that they were afraid of me all along, afraid of what it would mean if a woman with working hands turned out to be worth more than all their costumes. They spent years trying to make me feel small, so they wouldn't have to feel it themselves. I don't feel small anymore. I have a callus on my right palm and a scar on my forearm and a hospital full of operating rooms that stay the right temperature because of work I did with my own two hands. My name is on the permits. My name is on the lease. My name, Quinn Vasquez, is on a contract worth more than the house in Bexley. They spent 30 years pretending I wasn't good enough to enter. If you're out there sitting quietly at the far end of some table, letting people who never built anything tell you that what you do isn't enough, I need you to hear me. Stop waiting for their permission. Build the thing. Keep the paper. And when the day comes that the truth is too big to seat at the kids' table, you won't need their toast. You'll already have your own. For 5 years, I told myself that staying quiet was the kind thing to do. Sitting at the far end of the table, smiling to the toasts, letting Margaret call me practical, like it was an insult I hadn't earned the right to refuse. I called it keeping the peace. But peace built on someone else's silence isn't peace at all. It's just a debt collecting interest. Adela taught me that sitting in her wheelchair at 81, finally saying the thing she'd swallowed for 30 years. The cost of her silence wasn't paid by her, it was paid by me at the kids' table, year after year. Here's what I've come to believe. Nothing in that tent happened by accident. Margaret looked down on working hands because she was terrified of how close her own castle had come to crumbling. Richard read every business journal and never saw my name. Because contempt makes you blind to the very thing you despise. And I stayed invisible so long not because I lacked proof, but because some part of me was still waiting for their permission to be more than they'd decided I was. Every choice planted a seed. The harvest just took years to come in. What pulled me out of it wasn't luck. It was the quiet work nobody clapped for. 2,000 documented hours before a single license. Nights at trade school while running service corps in the daylight. 110 pages of a proposal written when I should have been sleeping. That kind of grit doesn't announce itself. It just shows up again and again on the days you'd rather not. If you want to build something real, you have to fall in love with the unglamorous middle, the part where no one is watching and the result is still years away. But effort alone wasn't enough, and I want to be honest about that. I also had to learn to think clearly, to keep the paper, to know the difference between being modest and hiding. Adela's whole life came down to one sentence she said to me in that closet. You keep the receipts, sweetheart. Wisdom like that isn't about being clever. It's about seeing what matters before you need it. And the last thing, the thing I almost got wrong, is that none of it means anything if you become cruel in the proving. I didn't walk out of that tent to humiliate Margaret. I walked out to stand next to the woman who'd stood up for me. The goal was never revenge. It was refusing to let anyone, including myself, treat honest work as something to apologize for. So if you're at the far end of your own table tonight, I won't tell you it gets easier. I'll tell you to do the work, keep your receipts, and stay decent while you rise. They'll see you eventually, and when they do, you won't need their toast. You'll already have your own.